We've been working through 1 Corinthians chapter by chapter for the last 7 or 8 weeks now, and we'll continue doing that all the way up almost till our summer break that we take. I'm excited about it, but one of the things that I end up doing in the week, and if you've been reading ahead, you know some of the texts that we're going into, and I don't know what your regular Bible engagement looks like in your day-to-day life. I don't know how much time you're spending reading the scriptures, but there's an experience that maybe you've had in which you open the Bible to engage with it, and you land in a place and you're reading it, and you're trying to think about it, and you're trying to understand what it has to say to you, and you're really trying to take it seriously, and by the end of your reading, you end up feeling like this. I have to be honest with you, I kind of felt that way in 1 Corinthians chapter 7. Like most of the time I'm spending the week trying to think about how I can describe to us what Paul is trying to say to the church. And this week I spent a lot of time trying to answer the question, why in the world is Paul talking about this? I'm just going to warn you up front. I probably should have warned you before you were sitting here, but we're going to cover some stuff in here that's a little bit strange. It's a little on the nose. And this chapter is long, but I've committed that I'm reading to you every week the chapter before we go into it, so we're going to do that. You can follow along as we head into 1 Corinthians chapter 7, or you can just listen to me read it over you. I've been trying to read the last 2 verses of the previous chapter just to give us a little running start. So here's how that last chapter ended, the last 3 verses actually. Flee from sexual immorality. All other sins a person commits outside the body, but whoever sins sexually sins against their own body. Don't you know that your bodies are temples of the Holy Spirit who's in you, whom you've received from God? You are not your own. You were bought at a price. Therefore, honor God with your bodies. That's how chapter 6 ends. And then chapter 7 starts in verse 1, and here's what it says. Now, for the matters you wrote about, it's good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. But since sexual immorality is occurring, each man should have sexual relations with his own wife, and each woman with her own husband. And the husband should fulfill his marital duty to his wife, and likewise the wife to her husband. A wife doesn't have authority over her own body, but yields it to her husband, and in the same way, the husband does not have authority over his own body, but he yields it to his wife. Do not deprive each other, except perhaps by mutual consent and for a time, so that you can devote yourself to prayer, then come back together again, so that Satan will not tempt you because of your lack of self-control. I say this as a concession, not a command. I wish that you were all as I am, but each of you has your own gift from God. One has this gift, another has that. Now to the unmarried and the widows, I say, it's good for them to stay unmarried as I do. But if they cannot control themselves, they should marry, for it's better to marry than to burn with passion. To the married I give this command, not I, but the Lord. A wife must not separate from her husband, but if she does, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband, and a husband must not divorce his wife. To the rest I say this, I, not the Lord. If any brother has a wife who's not a believer and she's willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. And if a woman has a husband who is not a believer and he's willing to live with her, she must not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they're holy. But if the unbeliever leaves, let it be so. The brother or sister is not bound in such circumstances. God has called us to live in peace. How do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife? Nevertheless, each person should live as a believer in whatever situation the Lord has assigned to them, just as God has called them. This is the rule I lay down in all the churches. Was a man already circumcised when he was called? He shouldn't become uncircumcised. Was a man uncircumcised when he was called? He shouldn't become circumcised. Circumcision is nothing, and uncircumcision is nothing. Keeping God's commands is what counts. For each person should remain in the situation they were in when God called them. Were you a slave when you were called? Don't let it trouble you. Although if you can gain your freedom, do so. For the one who is a slave when called to faith in the Lord is the Lord's freed person. Similarly, the one who is free when called is Christ's slave. You were bought at a price. Do not become slaves of human beings. Brothers and sisters, each person as responsible to God should remain in the situation they were in when God called them. Now, about virgins. I have no command from the Lord, and I give a judgment as one who is by the Lord's mercy trustworthy. Because in the present crisis, I think it is good for a man to remain as he is. Are you pledged to a woman? Don't seek to be released. Are you free from such a commitment? Don't look for a wife. But if you do marry, you haven't sinned. And if a virgin marries, she's not sinned. But those who marry will face many troubles in this life, and I want to spare you that. For what I mean, brothers and sisters, is that the time is short. From now on, those who have wives should live as if they do not, those who mourn as if they did not, those who are happy as if they were not, those who buy something as if it was not theirs to keep, those who would use the things of the world as if not engrossed in them, for this world, in its present form, is passing away. I'd like for you to be free from concern. An unmarried man is concerned about the Lord's affairs, how he can please the Lord, but a married man is concerned about the affairs of the world, how he can please his wife, and his interests are divided. An unmarried woman or a virgin is concerned about the Lord's affairs. Her aim is to be devoted to the Lord in both body and spirit, but the married woman is concerned about the affairs of this world, how she can please her husband. I'm saying this for your own good, not to restrict you, but that you may live in a right way in undivided devotion to the Lord. If anyone is worried that he might not be acting honorably toward the virgin he's engaged to, and if his passions are too strong and he feels he ought to marry, he should do as he wants. He's not sinning. They should get married. But the man who settled this matter in his own mind, who's under no compulsion, but has control over his own will, and who has made up his mind not to marry the virgin, this man also does the right thing. Then he who marries the virgin does right, and he who doesn't marry her does better. A woman is bound to her husband as long as he lives. But if her husband dies, she's free to marry anyone she wishes, but he must belong to the Lord. In my judgment, she's happier if she stays as she is. And I think that I too have the Spirit of God. This is the word of the Lord. All right. I got to be honest with you guys. I really love my job. It's a lot. Most of the time, it's a lot of fun. I get paid to study the Bible, to seek the Lord. I get to come and tell you the things I've discovered. I really like it. But then I get to this, and I'm like, I get to talk to them about their private sexual life. Doesn't that sound fun? It's not. I don't really want to talk about this stuff with you guys. And like I said, I'm sitting here going what in the world is Paul going on about? This is so long and so detailed, and he's covering every single angle of the conversation. What about this, and what about that, and what about them, and what about this, and who? Why? Why are you talking about this? I just want to remind you, one of the things we set up in the intro in the sermon, and I know anytime that we're in the middle of a series like this, there's someone sitting in the room right now who's like, I just showed up today. Yep, this is what we do. We read the Bible, we talk about it, we encourage each other, and some parts of the Bible are weird. This is the reality. Just for context to remember, the Apostle Paul planted a church in a place called Corinth almost 2,000 years ago, and then he wrote a letter back to that church answering real questions that those people had. This is one of the slides I used in that first week. 1 Corinthians isn't written to us. We're listening to one end of a telephone call and trying to suss out what in the world's going on the other end. And we're a long way removed from that. So a day like today is a challenge because you read the text. I don't think it's actually really hard to understand what Paul's saying. He's pretty upfront. In fact, he's enumerating exactly what we should be doing. The question is, why in the world is he talking about all this stuff? That's the thing that I've been wrestling with this week and trying to figure out. And I actually think that I found something that might be helpful to give to you. And I want to illustrate the difficulty of a text like this by just looking at verse 1. Here's what it says in verse 1. Now for the matters you wrote about. Paul says, you folks in the church wrote me a letter, and I want to address it. And then he puts in quotes, it is good for a man not to have sexual relations with a woman. There's other translations that will say it's good for a man not to touch a woman. Now here's the problem that just kind of illustrates how difficult this can be. Who's being quoted here? Is Paul quoting the letter that the church wrote to him? Is Paul quoting them, quoting Paul in something he said earlier that he's trying to clarify? Are they quoting the culture and what the culture says about avoiding sexual immorality and asking Paul's opinion? We don't know. We know that he's referencing this quote, either something Paul said that they're confused about, either something people in the church are believing, or, and this is the one I actually think is going on, I think this follows the thread of Paul quoting common knowledge out in the culture. There was a strain of asceticism, meaning restriction of the body in Greek and Roman culture. So what they are doing is a very classic error. When you see most people in the world doing something wrong, in other words, living wild out in the culture, sexually immoral, they immediately look to the culture and say, what's the solution? And they find Greek and Roman ascetics who say, well, the answer is don't ever touch a woman. That's the answer. This is the challenge of trying to wrestle with the text. Just a reminder, Paul said, as we lead up to this, chapter 1, no divisions in the church. Christ came to unite. Number 2, chapter 2, the Spirit of God is the key. He's been given to you. He's enlightened you. Why are you proud and dividing from each other? Chapter 3, because the Spirit now inhabits you and the people of God, his temple is here in this place among you. Therefore, you have been entrusted with the mystery of the gospel revealed for the first time to humanity in the church. You have a job to do. You've been entrusted with something hugely important. Next, therefore, if that is true, you need to be who you are. Your behavior should reflect this truth about what's happened to you. And then last week we said, you are not your own. Paul is confronting the Corinthian culture's belief that my physical self does not matter in my spiritual life. Only the real inner me, the part that's in my heart and in my head, matters. My physical self doesn't matter at all. Paul says that's not the way this works. I think the key to understanding not only this chapter, but potentially the entirety of the letter of 1 Corinthians actually comes in verse 26. I think it's verse 26, in which Paul he suddenly pivots and he starts addressing more groups of people. And then he says this little phrase, he says, in this present crisis. Now I read that and I immediately go, whoa, what's going on? What is he talking about? What is this present crisis? How is this impacting what's going on? Here's what I think, and this is not unique to me. A lot of scholars believe this, but I did a deep dive on it this week and I found it compelling. This present crisis is famine. Famine is haunting the empire. How do we know? Well, there's a lot of clues out there that help us to know. The first one comes in the book of Acts. If you're newer to the church, if you're newer to the Bible, the book of Acts is an incredible part of your New Testament. So we're reading right now 1 Corinthians, a letter that the Apostle Paul wrote to a church he planted. The book of Acts is the recording of how the early church and the Apostle Paul specifically made all these trips. So if you want to find out, how did Paul get to Corinth and what happened when he got there and how did he plant the church, it's all recorded in the book of Acts. Earlier in the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 11, it records this moment. It says, during this time, some prophets came down from Jerusalem. So they came from the religious hub, the center of where the church began, and they came to Antioch, which is the church that Paul is being sent from. It's Paul's home church. And one of those guys, his name was Agabus, stood up during a service, and through the Spirit, he made a prediction. It says that he predicted that a severe famine would spread all over the Roman world. This is happening probably in the late 30s AD, some 5 to 7 years after Jesus' death and resurrection. And then Luke, the gospel writer and the writer of the book of Acts, includes for us a very helpful footnote. I didn't put the parentheses under there. Luke does, right in the text. He says, hey, that prediction actually happened during the reign of Claudius, the empire. Remember, Luke's writing this later. He's recalling what happened, and he said, hey, that prediction that guy made was pretty uncanny because it actually happened under the reign of Claudius, who is the emperor at the time that Paul is planting this church in Corinth and writing from Ephesus back to the church. Now you go, okay, well, that's one verse out of Acts chapter 11. Is that really compelling? Not really, but also we have a historical record. Here's 2 Roman historians writing at exactly this time in history. Tacitus says this year there was a shortage of corn resulting in famine. it was established that there was no more than 15 days' supply of food in the city of Rome. In the capital of the world's greatest empire, the famine is so severe at the heart that there's 2 weeks of food left. That's a scary place to be. In fact, it is so disruptive that another historian records this moment. He says, there was a scarcity of grain because of a long continued drought, and Claudius was once stopped in the middle of the forum by a mob. Claudius, their president, is walking through the forum, and people are so mad and so worried about famine that they mob him and try to beat him up. He barely escapes, the text says. This is what's going on, the tension that's going on in the background. I don't know if you've been paying attention to local-ish news over the last number of weeks, but there were some news stories that bubbled up about the Colorado River Compact. If you don't know what that is, that's fine. But it's really important to, surviving in the desert. Here's the way it works. The Colorado River, which is Arizona's western border, has a lot of water in it. Really going to dumb it down. There's a lot of water in that there river, and there's 7 states that share the water that comes out of the Colorado. And Arizona is one of those states. We just happen to be at the end of the trickle. And there has to be an agreement about how much water each one of those states upriver is going to use before it gets to us in order to allow us to survive. Some 37% of Arizona's water usage comes directly out of the Colorado. And the problem with that is not that we need to share, but all that water comes from outside of Arizona. It's coming from the Sierra Nevada snowmelt or places like that. Someone who knows better than me knows exactly where it's coming from. And the reality is, unless upstream they agree to send us water, they could just suck it all up, and then we're left with a dry riverbed. And that's a big problem. That's Lake Mead right there. You can see how low it is. The reason I talk about this is because this is exactly what was going on in Corinth. If you think things were tough in the Roman capital, imagine you get out to the hinterlands into a place like Corinth. Corinth is an important military city, but it sits on cliffs and rocks overlooking the harbor. They have no place to grow grain on their own. All the food for a place like Corinth is imported. And now there's a massive famine. There's huge inflationary pressures. Costs have went through the roof. There's not enough food to go around. And then you go, okay, well, how does that impact a letter like 1 Corinthians? Does it? Well, I would say the minute I read this, I started going back through the book. And I'm like, I think I was talking to Brian. I was like, Brian, you would not believe how much Paul talks about food. Over 70 times in this one letter, Paul references food, eating, drinking, going hungry. I mean, we've already touched on some of these issues. Next week, we're going to talk about what we should do about food sacrificed to idols. Why in the world does he care about this? Because this is day-old meat left over from a weird, demonic temple practice. Can we eat that meat? Why would you care unless it was cheap and meat was hard to come by? Later on, he's going to talk about correcting the church in the way they practice communion together, the Lord's table. And he'll say, hey, rich folks, you're really messing this up because you who have money are eating and getting fat and drunk while other people in the church are going hungry. I think he means that literally. Also, I think it unlocks why in the world is Paul going on about all this stuff about marriage, right? If you had been existing in a 10-year-long famine in which food was scarce, money was tight, you didn't even know where your next meal was come from, you're going to start asking some very fundamental questions like, should I get married? Should I start a family in this environment? What do I do about vulnerable single people in the church? Should we marry each other to help? What do we do? And Paul begins to write about this. Paul says, this is why I think Paul is correcting a Corinthian belief that the best thing to do in the face of rampant sexual immorality is just withdraw altogether. I think the reason that's what Paul's doing is because this next verse is to say, listen, that's a great idea and all, but I know what's actually happening. People are all over the place chasing down everything. Sexual immorality is happening. And the way you're going to fix that is by not restricting sex within marriage, but encouraging it. Paul is trying to address faithfulness in a confused world. Michael Gorman, who wrote a commentary on 1 Corinthians, one of the primary ones I'm using, he says this: some of the believers concluded that sex was basically permissible for anyone with anyone, while others thought it was not permissible at all for brothers and sisters. They're confused, and Paul's trying to help clarify. No. In marriage, this is what you should be pursuing. And he says, here's what it looks like. Suddenly he's very demure, and he does not want to use the actual term. He uses a euphemism, marital duty. He didn't do us that pleasure for any of the rest of the letter, but here's what he says: the husband should fulfill his marital duty, and the wife should fulfill her marital duty. And then picking up this idea that your body is not your own, he says within marriage, the wife's body belongs to the husband, and the husband's body belongs to the wife. And I want to pause here really quick before we move on, because this verse in particular has been abused so many times in the church. It has been abused by men and women who want to dominate their spouse sexually, who want to be demanding of their spouse sexually. It has been used and as an excuse for assault and unkindness in case after case after case after case. And I just want to say it because I don't want it to be on my conscience. So I'm transferring it to you. If you've been ever tempted to read this text and say, therefore I can demand anything I want, you're wrong. What Paul is saying is that marriage, as it's operating like it should, is a picture of union. Paul will say in other letters that, actually he'll say it in this letter, that what we see in marriage is a picture of Christ and the church being united in one, caring for each other, sacrificing for each other, laying down their lives for each other. And when a man and a woman get married, they should be living out the same thing. There should be a unity that happens in that. Jesus himself talks about this in Matthew when he says, so those two, that man and that woman who got married, they're no longer two people, but they're one flesh. And what God has wed together should never be separated. Jesus says there's something miraculous that is happening in marriage. Yes, it might be abused. Yes, it can be misread in the text. But that does not mean that the institution is still not designed to do what it's doing, which is to give us a picture of what it looks like. I just want you to know as we head into this, I have no intention of going through the entirety of this chapter and trying to teach it. There's a lot. I picked out a few of what I think are the highlights that are going to help us. What Paul says here is, I actually wish that you all were like I am. Now, you might say, what does he mean by that? Here's what he means. He's single and intentionally celibate. That's who Paul is. And Paul says his choice to be single and intentionally celibate is a good one that he wishes everyone could do, but he also understands that it's a gift that you might not have, but he does have. That's what he says. Each one of you has your own gift. Some have this one, some have that one. I wish you all could be like me. And here's the thing. You might be sitting in the room today as a single person who feel like somehow you are lesser than, or somehow you have failed at life, or somehow you're not an adequate part of the church because you're not married, not having a family. And I just want to tell you, if anyone in the church has made you feel that way, shame on us. That's on us. Because Paul would disagree vehemently with that position. In fact, here's what Paul would say: singleness is a superpower. Not everybody has it. Not everybody can absorb the rays of the sun and turn it into, laser beams out of their eyes. That's a Superman reference in case you missed it. Sam Alberry, who's a pastor out of Nashville, friend of ours here at the church, we got to spend some time with Sam. He wrote a book called 7 Myths about Singleness. And in that book, he says this: singleness is not a waste of a life. It's a gift from God, given not to restrict us, but to free us for a unique kind of devotion. That's what he says. He says, I wish everyone had the gift that I have had. I wish you could be freed to live under the devotion to the Lord and to not be concerned about these things. But I get it. You ain't all got that gift. That's what he says. And he says, so here's what you do. If you're unmarried or you're a widow, so in other words, if you're younger and never been married, or you're older and your spouse has died, it's good to stay unmarried. It's okay. You can be like me. You're not broken. It's fine. But if you can't control yourself, they should marry, for it's better to marry than to burn with passion. I don't know if this is a gift that I could have survived with. I mean, I looked at my wife, Rachel, and I saw her burning with passion for me. And I was like, I just cannot leave her in this state. I will sacrifice for her. Oh, she's in here for this one. She liked it the first time I did it. Right? He says, listen, if you're unmarried, now this is why the context matters. Why is Paul talking about this? Because people are trying to figure out, what are we supposed to do? There's not even enough food to go around, much less plan for the future of my life. Do I need to get married? Am I supposed to fix this somehow? And Paul says, no, you don't have to. But you might be burning with passion. And if you are, get married. Now, here's the deal. I make a joke about my wife's burning passion for me, because I like to. But I know what we think. We think, and rightfully so, because Paul's talking about the letter, we think about physical burning, right? But there's a reality, too, that there's an emotional burning that can come in a desire for marriage. Like, I am so consumed with the idea that I need to or want to or pursuing marriage. And Paul's saying, like, listen, that you're not broken. You don't have to. In fact, there's a superpower that comes along with your singleness. But if you're burning with passion, if you cannot get over this, then go for it. Find someone to get married. Now, I understand. I also might have described someone in the room who's like, listen, I've been burning for a long time and nobody's shown up to put out the fire. You're not broken, though. Paul says that you are uniquely gifted if you can embrace that gift. What we're seeing here, I think, is policy and procedure work. I'm part of a governing board for a church plant, helping them get off the ground, and I had a conversation last week with the board, and the guys who are helping lead the church, they're, just getting off the ground, and they'd come back from a conference, and they were all excited about trying to get a bunch of stuff in order. And the thing that they were asking about was policies and procedures. Like, we need to get policies and procedures in place. There's all these things that we need to get figured out. And I'm like, all right, tell me what you're worried about. And it's like, well, what do we do about property disputes? And what do we do about leases? And what do we do about security on campus? And I was like, bro, you're like 4 months old. You might be worrying about too much. Like, there are some things you should probably nail down, like how do you handle money in a way that's transparent and open? That's really important from the get-go. And probably how do we take care of kids in our kids ministry, because parents are really going to care about that. And the rest of this stuff, wait until it becomes an actual issue, and then you can think through your policies and procedures. You don't have to solve everything today. I think that's what we're seeing right now with Paul. Paul is writing policies and procedures for the church in real time. And here's what he says through just this chapter. To the married, I give this command. And then he qualifies, well, this is from the Lord. Don't get divorced. To the rest, I say this. Now, this is my opinion. This doesn't come from the Lord. This is the rule I'm giving to all the church. Here's the new procedure and policy we'll put in place in every church plant we start. And then the last one is like, here's what I don't know what to tell you about this, but I got a little wisdom to offer. Like, this is the reality of church leadership. If you think somehow that me or the other pastors or the elder team have this all figured out, that we know, we have like Jesus delivered us a policy and procedure manual about how to do everything correctly, we don't. Most of the time, you're doing this. Now about this, I have no command from the Lord, but I do have a judgment. That's part of what it looks like to try to figure it out. I think that's what we're seeing from Paul. One of the commentaries in 1 Corinthians says this: Paul is having to think on his feet. He's creating Christian ethics and church policy from scratch in a world where nothing like this has ever existed before. The people of God have never been in a place like Corinth. The people of God have never tried to bring Jew and Gentile together. The people of God have never had the Holy Spirit calling people from all kinds of places, and Paul's trying to figure it out. I think that's why this chapter feels weird. He's dealing with real things they're asking questions about. He says to the married people, and he says this is a command from the Lord. It's something we've believed and has been in the scriptures for a long time. You should not get a divorce. That's what it comes down. I mean, let's simplify. You shouldn't get a divorce. And the reason he says this is so important is because he believes that the scriptures teach that marriage is a commitment for life. Now listen, I understand. You personally might have a, yeah, but what about, and then you talk about your situation, what's happened to you. Yeah, but what about someone you love and you care about who's been divorced and you have questions about that? I completely understand. There's a lot of circumstances that can break the oath of marriage that is made. Paul is talking about the normative experience, which is marriage is serious business. If you're just revved up with passion, that's probably not a sufficient reason to commit yourself for the rest of your life to this knucklehead. You better take it seriously. You better think about it twice, because when you sign up, you're in it for the rest of your days. Now, I want to say, because I have an amazing wife, that that's a really great thing. But Paul's saying, if you're not married yet, slow your horses. Think about this. Another commentary on 1 Corinthians says this: Christians have always acknowledged there's two routes to embodying faithfulness in the church. Celibate singleness, that's Paul's choice, that was Jesus' choice, and faithful marriage. Those are the two options. And in both conditions, we testify that our bodies are submitted to the power of God. Whether you're in a married relationship in which you're faithful to each other for life, or you're single and celibate, both are ways to be faithful. And one is not superior to the other. And Paul's trying to talk to the church about this idea. And then he brings up this, what I think is a really encouraging idea, especially if you're here in the church and this describes you. He says, what happens if someone becomes a Christian but their spouse doesn't? What happens if the Spirit woos a woman and her husband has no interest? What happens if the Spirit woos a man, calls a man, and his wife wants nothing to do with it? Paul says, stay with it. And then the reason why I think is really encouraging. If I just described your life, I want to encourage you with Paul's words. Husbands are sanctified through their wife. Unbelieving wives have been sanctified through their believing husband. Otherwise, their children would be unclean, as it is they're holy. Now listen, I understand. You take this text completely out of context and say to someone who doesn't know the whole totality of the Bible, what does this mean? It seems like Paul could be saying that your faith saves your spouse. Now all you have to do is read 3 verses outside of this context and go, well, that can't possibly be what he means. It seems like Paul could be saying that as long as you're a Christian parent, your kids are guaranteed to be saved. None of Paul's other teaching reinforces that. So what do we make of this text? I think it's actually really beautiful. Here's what I think Paul is saying. A Christian spouse and a Christian parent bring the holiness of the temple of God into their home and into their family. You make the place that your unbelieving spouse and your young children grow up in a place of holiness, a place dedicated to the Lord, a place that has the Spirit of God inhabiting it, and who knows what could happen in that environment? Who knows what could happen? In fact, Paul says, it's actually, I don't know if I quoted it here, but he says, husbands, did you ever think about the fact that you might be the one that helps save your wife? Wives, did you ever think that you might be the one? And I know that might be describing you. You might be the Christian in your family who's been doing this for 30 years while your spouse is uninterested. You might be the parent who's tried to be a faithful Jesus follower while you raised your kids and you watched them walk away from the faith and want anything to do with it. And I'll tell you, as a pastor, when I talk to people, there's a simple phrase that I use around these kinds of stories all the time. And you maybe have heard me say it, and I'll say it to you again. God writes long stories. You want it fixed today, you want it fixed yesterday, and God writes stories that take decades and generations. And Paul says, stick with it. You might have your mind blown 40 years from now, 50 years from now, when he uses your faithfulness to save. He says, okay, here's the basic rule. If we want to figure out, well, what are we supposed to do? Paul says, here's what we should do. When you get saved, don't rush to change everything. One of the things that you get the blessing to do as a pastor in a church is you spend a lot of time with people who are in grief, grieving a variety of things: the loss of a spouse, the loss of a parent, loss of siblings, loss of children. And there's like general knowledge out there that's not church knowledge even necessarily, it's just general knowledge. And I've used it many times because when people are in that kind of hurt and their life is changing, they have this instinct, and I see it over and over again, to make some drastic change in their life. I think I might move to Guatemala. Whoa. The general advice is this: you shouldn't make any major life decisions for 12 months after you've experienced grief. And the reason for that is people don't always make clear-eyed decisions when they're in the middle of something. And maybe you've met this person. They discovered Jesus and they're so on fire that they're burning their life down. They're changing everything. They can't wait to confront everyone. They can't wait to break up with their spouse. Everything needs to change. And Paul's like, just hold your horses. Stay as you are. Then he uses weird examples like if you're already circumcised, don't get uncircumcised. He does not go into detail on how that works. I didn't ask. But he says, here's a basic rule. Let's keep it simple. When you come to faith, stay as you are. Let's just do that. Because sometimes the wisest move is just to stay put, just to be faithful, just to stay there and see what God does. You're not stuck. You're being wise. You're being prudent. And that's okay. And he says, here's what I really mean by that. The time is short. Now, let's be honest. Paul wrote this letter nearly 2,000 years ago. His definition of short and mine are a little different. When he wrote this letter to the church in Corinth, Jesus had only been gone from the earth for probably between 15 and 20 years. Not very long. And when they looked at what was going on in the culture around them, and they saw famine, and they saw war, and they saw injustice, and they saw struggle in the empire, they read that as potential judgment because Jesus was going to come back. And so Paul says, listen, time is short. Jesus is coming. Therefore, we have to act as if that's true. If you're married, you act as if you're not. In other words, your spouse is not the ultimate thing that's going to save you and need all of your attention. If you're mourning, what are you mourning for? Because all is going to be set right. If you're happy, make sure you're joyful about the right things. If you have things, are you using them for the right purpose? Because Paul says this whole thing, the whole order, the whole structure, the whole plausibility structure of our culture is going away. And therefore, you have the freedom to act as if that is true. Here's what he says. Remember, use your gifts for the mission. Don't be engrossed by them. You have a lot of great stuff in your life. A marriage, a family, friends, a home, money, security, freedom, a voice. You have it all. They are not bad things to be shunned. They're good gifts to be stewarded for the mission of God in the bringing of the kingdom on earth as it is in heaven. Don't get caught up in the ownership of the gifts. That's what Paul is saying. And then he tries to give some concern. This is how he wraps up. This is not quite the end of the chapter, but I think this is functionally where Paul kind of ends this idea. He says, I would like you to be free from concern. That's what he wants for the church. And he says, listen, I'm saying this for your own good, not to restrict you, but I want you to have the freedom to live in the right way with undivided devotion to the Lord. That's what I want for you. Right, Paul's confronting a lie that the Corinthian people believed and we believe too. And here's what the lie is. That any restriction on you, anything that doesn't allow you to perfectly express what you want and what you desire is somehow unimaginably restrictive. And Paul says, no, it's not. In fact, it might be the very way that you can choose to live a life free of concern, to let things go, and to be devoted to the Lord. So, a sermon like this, I have one slide left. And a sermon like this is tough because, tomorrow you go to work or to school and somebody says, what did you learn at church yesterday? And you're like, I don't know. He went on about sex and famine and stuff. I don't know what he was talking about. It's real, like it's hard. How do I summarize it? And so landing on this slide is if you get to take one thing away and like put it in your pocket, and this is what I'm going to use today, because the reality is Paul's addressing issues that we're really not addressing in the kind of crisis level that we are. So what are we supposed to do with this text? This is what I want you to take away with it, okay? Here it is. The question about anything that comes up in your life this week, next year is this: how will this decision impact my devotion to the Lord? When Paul summarizes all these details, he gets to the bottom and he says, here's what I want for you. I want you to be free from concern so you can give yourself in devotion to the Lord. That's what he wants for you. So whatever you're facing, should I take a new job? Should I spend money on a new car? Should I marry this person? Should I? The rubric that we get to use, that Paul gives us here, is this question: how will this decision affect my devotion to the Lord? That's the question we get to ask. And that question cuts to the heart of every question, because it really gets to what matters. It gets to the ground level. It says, what really matters is your life with Jesus. Everything else is in service to that. So how will this decision impact that question? Now, I will also confess as I finish, that's not always easy to figure out. That's why you need these people. That's why you need a church community. That's why you need wisdom of others who have committed their lives to following Jesus alongside you. That's why you need trusted advisors who will wrestle with you. Because our desire, at least mine, and I pray you share it with me, is that we would be devoted to Jesus and to Jesus alone. Let's pray that God would help us to do that. God, thank you so much for this text. Thank you for Paul and his faithfulness to the church in Corinth. God, thank you for the questions that he's answering and attempting to institute policy and wisdom on behalf of the church. God, I pray that we would be a place filled with wisdom and a desire to be, above all else, devoted to you. God, Jesus is worthy of our devotion. We pray this in his name. Amen.